A huge, patient animal folding his arms around a thin human frame. The kind of image that stops a scroll and holds the breath of a yard, of a timeline, of a room full of strangers. The light is late and soft, as if the sun itself has leaned closer to watch. You can hear, if you listen, a low rumble under that stillness. Something like a throat clearing, like distant surf, like a weathered instrument marking the measure of the world. The gorilla leans in. The man, whose name and place are indefinido, does not retreat. His hands rest where hands must rest, steady, unclutching the small geometry of habit. One palm finds a chest, another settles on a shoulder. The gorilla tests the air with a wide, moist nose, then presses that great palm gently against the man's ribs, as if to confirm the truth of breath. There are 1,000 tiny things that lead to such a beat of recognition. A whistle that no one else uses, repeated at dusk. A tray set down in the same place at the same angle, the shape of habit worn into fur and bone. A hand smoothing the edge of a nest. These are unglamorous labors, lifting, carrying, waiting. The small choreography of care repeated until it becomes a map written on skin and sense. The footage you have seen frames the end of that map, the point where accumulated action becomes visible. It is straightforward and strange, tender and restrained. The people in the shot are staff, keepers, guardians. The setting is a sanctuary or rehabilitation center, indefinido in the particulars. That is important. This is not a story about pet ownership or novelty keeping. It is a story about rescue, about someone choosing for years to be the same steady presence in an otherwise uncertain world. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that small acts, repeated, matter. The ritual of care is worth lingering on because ritual is the soil out of which recognition grows. Feeding at dusk is not only about calories. The hour matters. Dusk has its own grammar of light and safety. The keeper arrives with the same turn of shoulder, the same soft, private sound. A particular whistle that has been taught, or perhaps learned, by the animals over seasons. Hands that have felt callous and kindness run along woven bedding. Check for the right placement of straw. Tuck in a sleeping form. These gestures sound ordinary until you try to imagine them absent. Remove them, and the world of the animal shifts. Pathways lose their worn edges. The names of places become unmoored. Replace them and patterns reassert themselves, like rows of seedlings bending toward a repeated sun. Sanctuary work, by its nature, holds contradictions. There are protocols, separation when needed, limits on access, rules that protect both animal and human. Sometimes a period apart is medical necessity. Sometimes it is a policy born of prudence. Those gaps accumulate like winter winds. They do not erase what came before. The map remains in muscle and memory. But they complicate any tidy narrative of reunion. When close contact is permitted again, it is under watchful eyes and trained hands. There is joy, certainly, but that joy exists within a frame of stewardship rather than ownership. Caretakers intervene not to seize a moment for themselves, but to steward the safety of everyone present. That ethical contour must be explicit. What you watched was care in a sanctuary context, not an endorsement of keeping wild animals as domestic companions. Picture now. Move the scene into a different register, and imagine it taking place in a garden that has been tended for generations. Imagine, for a moment, the Garden of Hesperides, not as an ancient claim about gods and immortality, but as a frame for thinking about what patient tending yields. Imagine narrow paths of crushed earth, hedges trimmed by hands that know where to leave a wildness intact and where to prune. Imagine trees planted with a long horizon in mind. In that garden, the work is slow. Watering is done with attention rather than haste. Roots are watched as if they were conversation partners. The caretakers who walk those paths do not expect miracles overnight. They know that fruit is the sum of seasons. In this allegory, the rituals of the sanctuary map to gardening practices. The whistle is a watering can laid down beside a sapling. The evening tray is a steady hand of compost returned to the earth. The repeated presence becomes the light that coaxed the leaf. Golden apples, the metaphorical fruit of this tale, are not a sudden largesse bestowed on a favored few. They are the visible, glinting evidence of patient labor, a gloss of dusk on an apple's skin, the soft crackle when it finally gives to the touch. To call the outcome golden is to highlight its worth and fragility. The apples shine because the sun has been allowed to do its slow work, and because someone kept the foxes and rot at bay long enough for ripening to occur. Allegory helps us see what was always there. The reunion you watched becomes a harvest scene. In a harvest, timing matters. Go too early and the fruit is sour. Go too late and it falls and bruises. So, the great ape leans forward with the patience of a branch that has learned the rhythm of a gardener's footfall. First comes the sniff, an act of recollection that is almost chemical, as if the animal is reading the ledger of months in a single inhalation. Then a tentative touch, fingers spread, feeling for the shape of a human chest the way a vine might find the surface of a supporting trellis. The small series of gestures is precise. Head tilt, inhalation, a rumble that sounds like approval or perhaps a recognition-fueled exhale. In the garden picture, the tree bends slightly toward the hand that has always pruned and watered it. An apple trembles on its stem but does not fall. That tremble is the moment of mutual acknowledgement, not a consummation but a confirmation. This is not to sentimentalize the scene. Visible tenderness exists alongside the complexity of captivity and rehabilitation. A touching moment on camera does not erase the lifetime of interventions, veterinary care, behavioral conditioning, policy constraints that frame a sanctuary's work. Nor does it erase the ethical question of when closeness becomes intrusion. The keepers in the footage step forward with a practiced lightness, not to claim dominion but to guard balance. Their presence is a reminder that stewardship is active, not passive. It requires judgment and sometimes the painful choice to keep distance for the sake of safety. There is also, woven through the public's reaction, an explanation for why such images travel. People are hungry for tenderness in a culture that often accelerates and anonymizes care. We live in economies of immediacy where effort is expected to pay immediate dividends. To see, instead, the slow accrual of trust, a decade's worth of small acts folded into a single embrace, is almost scandalously consoling. It suggests that patient presence still counts, that repetition yields something visible, that the world can be nudged gently and persistently toward safety and recognition. Online, the image becomes a mirror. Viewers project their own long, unnoticed labors, the phone calls kept, the visits made, the quiet rituals of being there, onto that instant of contact. The golden apple glints not only in the garden, but in the private lives of those who have tended something small and watched it quietly thrive. If you imagine divine rest in this context, hear it as a particular shade of calm. It is not a theological claim enforced by the allegory, nor is it a promise traded for human effort. Think of it as the hush after the harvest, when the tools are laid down and the tired hands can simply be. Divine rest here is an inward settling, the sense that, having been faithful to small tasks, one is allowed to breathe without defensive readiness. It is the mutual safety that arrives when two beings, who have taught each other the rules of presence, accept the same hush. The phrase points to restoration. Not miraculous in a showy sense, but real in the way a heartbeat slows when company is trustworthy. We should also be honest about the limits of what the camera can tell us. A single viral clip compresses years into seconds and asks us to take that compression as though it were a whole book. It leaves out the days of tedium, the nights of worrisome storms, the policy meetings, the months when separation was medically necessary. It erases the countless small refusals as much as it highlights a single allowance. The tenderness it captures is therefore both real and indexed. An index we can read, but which requires context to interpret fully. That context is indefinido in the particulars, but it is present in the practices. Feeding at dusk, a ritual whistle, hands smoothing a nest, protocols that govern safe proximity. There is another strand worth following: how caretakers themselves are changed by the work. The repeated labor reshapes not only the animal, but those who care. Patience becomes a muscle, not merely a disposition. The ritual of arrival, the tray at dusk, the whistle, teaches a kind of humility. You cannot insist upon recognition. You can only remain faithful to the pattern. In return, recognition arrives not as a contract, but as a gift. The gardener does not demand fruit. She tends in hope. The hope is not naive. It is practical, rooted in an experience that proves the efficacy of steadiness over spectacle. So, what are the golden apples we might harvest in ordinary life? They are not grand vindications. They are the nod of a child who knows you always show up, the way an elderly neighbor relaxes when she hears your footstep, the subtle trust of a friend who brings their true name to the table. They are small, luminous returns on fidelity, recognition, rest, reciprocal safety. They are the inward calm, the divine rest that comes when our repeated acts of presence have formed a landing place for another's fear. As you watch that embrace again in your mind, note the recurring images: the tilt of the head, the dusk light glazing the fur, the steady palm on the chest. Let them teach you the grammar of care. If you are called to tend, whether to a person, a place, or an animal under the careful stewardship of a sanctuary, remember the ethical frame. Honor boundaries. Respect the expertise of trained hands. Celebrate tenderness, but do not instrumentalize it. The garden teaches both patience and prudence. Tend well and wait well. At the end of the day, the image that traveled the world offers a modest but potent lesson. It tells us that small, consistent acts accumulate into something recognizably good, that rituals are the slow architecture of trust, that reunion, when it arrives, can look like harvest, complete with trembling fruit, gentle hands, and a hush that says, for a moment, the world is enough. Divine rest, in this telling, is that soft hush, an inward quiet that follows faithful tending, open to anyone willing to do the work of being present. If this has held you, if the scene has reminded you of someone you steady in your life, consider sharing it with a person who needs reminding that quiet, repeated care changes things. Subscribe for more reflections that look closely at the bonds between people, places, and the small patient acts that, over time, yield their own quiet harvest.